Welcome to Cafe 229 Live. Today, we're very happy and honored to have Dr. Doris Chang. Dr. Doris Chang is a clinical psychologist, an NYU professor, but most importantly, she's an expert in the mental health issues related to the community of color. Hi, Dr. Chang.
Hi, great to be here virtually with you all.
Yay. So, very happy to have you. I'm so glad that you can come join us today. You know, when I first met you many years ago, I was so excited. There are only so many psychologists who can actually speak Chinese or are like Chinese looking. How did you get into this field to start with?
Well, so I can just kind of introduce myself as a US born Chinese American. I was born in Texas, and so my academic career was really situated in predominantly white spaces, right?
Okay.
So I was born in Texas in Fort Worth, Texas. Most of my peers were not Asian. I think there was one other Asian kid in my
Wow.
school. And as any of you who are second generation, you know, you like stay away from that one other Asian kid. And so there was a lot of kind of internalized stigma, I think, for me around what it meant to be Asian. And it really wasn't until I went to college and started encountering other Asian Americans and started studying Mandarin and started really beginning to explore what my identity meant to me. And increasingly became guided by a desire to really center my culture, my ethnicity in
Mm,
my future career path. So I was taking psychology classes at the University of Texas,
sure.
and I'm sitting in class and sort of like having this reaction over and over again of like, wait, how does this apply to explain my family's experience? Or could I imagine talking about this with my parents? Would they even understand this? And so I became really interested in how culture shapes our lived experiences, how it might shape expression of psychological health and well-being, and then also really interested in psychotherapy and clients of color. So it was a very personal interest. I think I was just really trying to understand my own experience as a second generation Asian American,
Sure.
and not finding what I needed in the standard curriculum.
So, based on your experience, it sounds like when you're learning all those psychological theories, you're like, yo, this is all for the white people.
Totally. That's exactly what yes, that was my reaction.
Yeah, because I remember when I want to be a psychologist, I told my relative, and the first thing I asked is, first, what is that? And
Yeah.
two, do you make money with it? I wonder you have the same kind of reaction.
Oh, yeah. So my parents. So I ended up going to do my PhD at UCLA. It was a really exciting time in the field of Asian American mental health because Dr. Stanley Su had gotten a huge federal grant to create the National Research Center on Asian American Mental Health. So it was like this incredible place where, you know, there were lots and lots of folks like me, senior scholars, mid-career and students who were just like kind of grappling with like, what does it look like to create a field of Asian American mental health? And I remember talking to my mom about this, and she literally was like, wait, Asian people have psychological problems? And so she was literally like, what? This is like, I've never heard of this. I've never heard anybody talk about this. Like, that's such a strange thing that you're doing. Um, and then, of course, over the years, you know, in talking with my mom about what I do, she would say, oh, you know, my friend, she has depression. And so it became
Yeah.
more on her radar, I think, once she began to think about it more and more.
And I think our audience, a lot of them are not from the traditional white family, probably have similar experiences, right? When you talk to your relatives and family member about mental health, how many of you get this kind of response like, what is it? Yeah, some of you did. Yeah. So I think this is sort of a common challenge then for mental to work as a mental health professionals with minority people or with people of color is that how can we translate psychological theory in a way that's useful for people who's not from that traditional culture. And I
Yeah.
know I know you teach courses at NYU to help the clinicians to become more prepared for this kind of issues. Can you say a little bit more about the course you teach, the cultural competency, the critical consciousness?
Yeah, so I'd be curious to know, first of all, in the audience, like how many of you are in a mental health profession or interested in going into mental health work?
Yeah,
How
just
many of you?
if you're interested in mental health field, well, we have some, yes. Well, that's
Okay,
good. We have some.
cool. So if you end up going into psychology or social work, you are probably going to take a class that is about diversity. It's required for licensure. So for the last 20 years, I've been teaching this required course, and I think it's great that it's required, like that clinicians now actually have to grapple with like what does it mean to think about how race, ethnicity, culture, gender, sexual orientation, religious belief, all of these things might shape how our patients see the world and might create some cultural distance in our ability to necessarily understand where they're coming from. So in my class, I really try to look at the reasons why we find it difficult to connect across cultures. And race is such an important stratifier of experience in the US context. And so a lot of the discussion is really around racialized experiences. You know, what does it mean? In this case, we're talking about Asian Americans. What does it mean to an Asian American to be perceived as Asian? How are we stereotyped? What kinds of race-related experiences do we have in the world? How do our cultural beliefs and values affect how we move through the world and how we make sense of mental health and what we value in terms of what it means to live a good life? And so some of the work that I do with my students is really around one, helping them really understand themselves as cultural beings so that we're making clear to ourselves, like, what are our assumptions about the world? How have we been raised? What do we value? And making that really explicit in our understanding so we can not go into a relationship assuming that someone else necessarily believes what we believe. So we first have to become aware of our own cultural programming and our own experiences of the world. And then I also think it's really important for us to be honest with ourselves about the stereotypes and beliefs we hold about others, right? Like we are not blank slates. We don't sit down with someone and automatically feel comfortable with them. And so we have to kind of acknowledge that there are some people we just feel like we click with and understand, and others we're like really struggling to connect with. And there's no shame in that. It's completely natural. But we do have to name it in order to address it, right? And so I think some of it is experiential, some of it's deepening our cultural knowledge about different communities and different groups and their histories of immigration, of racialization, of trauma, all of these things, and then trying to put all those pieces together, right? I do use a lot of contemplative practices in my classroom because these like sort of grappling with these issues and challenges brings up a lot of emotion for us, right? So if we think about like, if everyone in the audience could like think about for a moment, like if you were going to walk into a room and let's say you're about to meet your therapist, right? And you see someone, you walk into the room and you see someone who looks familiar to you, right? Who comes from a similar cultural background than you know, sort of think about how would that feel in your body, right? You might feel like, oh, like a sense of ease or a sense of comfort, right? You walk into a room and you see someone who is not like you from a very different cultural background, very different from you in some key way that matters to you, whether it's religion or age or education or culture. And then imagine like, what would that feel like for you in your body? Right? And we might notice we have a physiological experience of like anxiety or fear or of worry or of threat, right? And so those issues come up in my classroom a lot of people feeling a lot of anxiety and worry and fear. And so I find that using contemplative practices, reflective practices really help us sit in that discomfort, help us learn to manage that discomfort, because as clinicians and as providers, we're going to encounter patients who are different from us all the time, and we have to learn how to navigate the feelings that it arouses in us.
So I guess it's a challenge then for some of your students to sort of, they have to kind of imagine what kind of cultural being they are, but I think this applies to all of us in the sense that we kind of also have to be honest with ourselves to really examine our prejudice, our potential stereotypes, which is probably, I mean, I like to see myself as a nice person. I don't want to see myself as someone who discriminates others. So how do you deal with the challenges where people may not like to look at themselves that way?
Yeah, Peter, and I'm sure you come up with this all the time in your teaching too. Well, I really try to normalize it, first of all. Like, even though you're in a mental health training program, and I see this a lot with students who are like, but we're one of the good guys, like we're about to take a job that doesn't pay that much to try to help other people. And so there's this feeling of like, whoa, 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 like how dare you question my intentions and motivations? And it's not about that at all. It's about acknowledging the reality of what it means to live in a society that is unequal, that continues to push out and perpetuate ideas about minoritized, marginalized groups that are really negative and harmful. And that just by living and breathing this air, we naturally implicitly learn those things, right? So I really try to just say, just because you have those ideas in your head doesn't mean you believe them, right? If you walk down the street, all of us walk down the street, we walk into the subway, we're inundated with people, right? And it's like you can almost, if you pay attention, see the stereotypes and assumptions just fire off automatically. It has nothing to do with whether you believe them or that they're consistent with your values. They're just part of our programming. And so I really just try to normalize it. Like, it doesn't make you a bad person. It just makes you a student of culture, right? That you're here, you're learning. It's happening without your consent, really.
Yeah. And I assume this kind of cultural responsibility or cultural awareness shouldn't just apply to people who want to be a therapist. I think it should apply to all of us in some way, right? If you want to be a good citizen, you should have some awareness of the potential bias you may have towards other people.
Absolutely. Yes. I think that, this is also a major interest of mine from a research perspective is intergroup dynamics in general, right? How we live together in a diverse society, how we navigate difference, how we recognize our common humanity, even though there's a lot in our culture that tries to be really divisive. So yeah, I think these are challenges that we face just living in a multicultural society.
And what is the consequence you feel like when we don't pay attention or when we're not mindful, aware of our sort of biases towards others? Like what are the consequences for a regular me and you, I guess?
I think that we can unwittingly perpetuate discrimination and inequity in the spaces that we're in because we're not pausing to think like, why am I assuming this person's more qualified than this person? Or, in a classroom environment, I invite teachers and faculty to ask themselves, like, why is it that you might notice that you call on the same kinds of students over and over again? So research shows that teachers tend to call on males more than women in the classroom. You're like, oh, that's probably not something they're conscious of. It has something to do with it sort of implicit understandings of who might be knowledgeable. We have certain assumptions that if unchecked and unattended to, just kind of enact and repeat inequitable practices, right? Because we're not paying attention. So it can show up in our workplaces. It can affect who we gravitate to at a party. We might find ourselves, we walk into a strange situation and we're like, oh, who should I go talk to? And you just find yourself gravitating to certain people and not others, right? And so it cuts us off from forging into, meaningful relationships with people who are different from us. Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense because and I think it's great they use teacher as an example because teacher are not therapists, but we all have teachers. And if a teacher is not aware of her personal biases, she can create an environment that's not fair to a certain group of students Which
That's
I
right.
remember you're doing the research related to the teachers, right?
Yeah, actually. So, yeah, some of our work was looking at K through 5 teachers in New York City. Many of those teachers are white. A lot of the teachers who teach in schools are white. And many of them are really committed to disrupting racial inequity in schools, right? Disrupting the school to prison pipeline, et cetera. And yet they also struggle with how, facing um, a desire to do good in the classroom and yet feeling scattered and constrained in their ability to change the way that they teach so that they're not without meaning to reproducing inequities in their own classroom. So we designed a program that was kind of based on integrating mindfulness training into critical consciousness curricula, um, in order to help them deal with these feelings of guilt, anxiety, worry, fear that can derail our best intentions, right? And trying to give them some emotional tools to deal with those emotional barriers that can get in the way of them teaching differently, of them forging those really meaningful relationships with students of color in their classroom.
That's great. So you're sort of like combining mindfulness training with your cultural competency training and providing sort of new way to train the next generation of teachers how to be a more sensitive person in terms of cultural competency.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, like, it's my belief and in my own experience that, like, just trying hard isn't enough, and just reading books isn't enough, and just meditating isn't enough. Like, you really do need to combine those different levels of learning, the heart, the mind, body, all of those things to come together, because all of those things affect how we show up in relationship with each other, right?
Right.
And so I'm really trying to kind of tackle this from all of those different levels. Um, and in my own experience, in trying to do this with my own students, I think that it has it has yielded better outcomes than just teaching them from the head,
Would you give us an example on how you achieve that with your students?
Well, I always hear from students like, oh, this is the diversity course. This is the course where we're going to feel lots of feelings and we're going to, maybe feel a lot of guilt, shame, anger, frustration. I might get hurt in this classroom. I might, you know, um, have a really difficult conversation with someone. And so they're coming in already kind of tense and a little bit defended, right? Because nobody wants to peel back the layers of this veneer of like, I am so competent and I'm such a helpful person. Like nobody really wants to kind of look under the hood. And so I try to have us start with a grounding practice of meditation just to kind of soften the edges that we bring in those spaces. And we do a lot of community building, right? Because we do have to develop some trust with one another. Um, and and I assign readings because again, I'm trying to teach them some new concepts, maybe have them deepen their cultural knowledge about another group. And then halfway through the course, they do an assignment, or actually, sort of at the beginning, there is an assignment where they're really asked to examine what are the influences that have shaped who they are today, right? So they go through thinking about what they learned from their families, how they've learned what it means to be of their gender, of their race, um, unpacking different aspects of identity, and thinking about how do those things shape what they value, what they believe, um, what they feel like they have to offer in terms of strengths, and then sort of gaps in their knowledge and understanding. And they do this by interviewing each other because I'm also trying to help people feel less uncomfortable talking about this, So it might be like, to think about like, what is your first real memory of race? and starting to talk about race and racism or other forms of oppression, and and feeling it in their mouth and talking about it with someone else and facilitating someone else's discovery process about what it might mean to them. And students talk about how uncomfortable it is and how anxious they are. And I always say to them, well, if you can't do it here with the classmate, how are you going to do this with a client? Right? It can't be that you're only doing this for the first time with a client who really needs to talk about this with someone who can guide them through that. So it's things like that. And then we move on to more relational things where we're sort of really working with our own bias through the heart and through the mind, and doing some kind of compassion cultivation work to try to see where we're feeling a disconnection and seeing if we can bridge that gap through some, I think, really powerful compassion practices that can help us deepen our empathy and understanding.
No, it sounds very interesting. Such a wonderful exercise. Maybe I should try with my students one day, just to kind of like sit down, have a heart and heart talk with your classmate on what are the potential racial experiences you may have, and how does that influence you and make you who you are. I mean, my first racial experience probably when I first arrived in America. I mean, I don't know about race. The concept race really not in my experience until really arrived here, which is quite interesting itself. But I'm sure we have all different kind of discrimination and biases other than race back in Asia as well. Even though like in Buddhism we say treat all beings as equal, but I mean that's ideal. We always try our best to do that. But it's wonderful that you're sort of bringing cultural competency and mindfulness approach together. And this is not the only place you kind of bring the Eastern approach and I guess the Western approach together. You also did this with cognitive therapy and a Taoist approach. Can you say a little bit about how you came up with the idea of Taoist cognitive therapy?
So Taoist cognitive therapy, my version of it is an adaptation of Chinese Taoist cognitive psychotherapy, which was developed in China by two psychiatrists, Zhang Yaling and Dersen Yang, or Yang Desen, who are two psychiatrists in Hunan. And when I was a graduate student, I went to Hunan and I did my dissertation fieldwork at this hospital, Hunan Medical University. And I went there because I was interested in sort of changes in how Chinese patients were expressing psychological symptoms or distress. So really looking at the age-old question about somatization versus psychologization. And I met Dr. Yang there. He was working really closely with me. He was one of the folks who was kind of assigned to help facilitate my field work, and we worked closely together. And at the time, he was actually doing his PhD. He's a MD PhD, so he was a practicing psychiatrist for many, many years and was doing his PhD at the time. And he started telling me a little bit about a project he was doing, developing this Chinese Taoist cognitive psychotherapy. And we kind of kept in touch, and I learned a little bit more about what he was doing. It was really, really interesting and exciting. And I started to think later on about how uncommon it is for us in the US to really learn from indigenous practices and other cultural contexts, and then try to extract in some ways, like, what are the mechanisms of action that could apply here? How can we kind of do that cultural adaptation to pull out those pieces and then see if we can learn from that and benefit from that work in the US context, right? We typically, the cultural adaptation goes the other way, right? And so I was really interested in thinking about how to help him adapt what he was doing in the Chinese context to an Asian American context. And one of the reasons why I thought it might be really helpful is the rationale behind having a Taoist focused cognitive therapy in terms of why he developed it in the first place. Was it had to do with some system constraints about how mental health systems work in China. And this was really in the 80s and 90s. And then secondly, trying to find an intervention that resonated with Chinese clients, right? And so he kind of started integrating Taoist principles into his work with clients in China, because a lot of these clients were coming in for quick consultations. They weren't thinking, oh, I'm going to now see this person for a year, once a week, for an hour a week. They were coming in saying, like, doctor, I'm having difficulty sleeping. I'm struggling. I'm stressed out. What should I do? So they were really wanting a quick consultation, almost like a life hack. Like, can you give me something that will help me, that I can take with me, right? And so he was started offering these like little nuggets of wisdom from Taoism, mostly to help folks with anxiety at the time, because he himself was a Taoist. He was like thinking this could be really helpful, because they don't have the resources or capacity to come in for once a week therapy for many, many weeks, right? It came in at a time in Chinese history uh, when society was kind of at a state of great social change and transition. And and I started thinking, just based on my own experience as a second generation immigrant, like, wow, who knows transition and upheaval more than an immigrant coming to a very different context, right? Where everything, the language, the cultural ways of being, everything is like being renegotiated and questioned. And so it seemed to be maybe a good cultural fit to try to learn from those experiences, trying to adapt it to the US context, and specifically to see if it could be helpful to immigrants here.
So the spirit is really we should find ways to sort of modify the westernized, well, I mean, it's not westernized, it is Western psychotherapy in a way that's available to people who are not familiarized with this type of treatment. So for Chinese immigrants, as we mentioned earlier, that many Chinese immigrants don't have sort of the concept of mental health. So you may want to come up interventions that's more familiarized, that sounds a bit more familiar to them in some way, such as combining the Chinese philosophy, Taoism, with Western cognitive therapy. But I don't think, how many of you know what Taoism is? Can you raise your hand if you know what Taoism is? Like one, that's it? Okay, so I think you may need to explain a little bit what Taoism is, just so they have some sort of context.
That's such a big question. Well,
No pressure.
right.
No pressure. By the way, Taoism, if you really want to get into it, it takes like years of practice. But if you could just give a few.
Yeah, I would say Taoism is one of the three major kind of cultural philosophical systems that have really shaped Chinese culture, right? We see Taoism, Confucianism, and Buddhism. And Taoism has this like really long and multifaceted history in China, and there's different kinds of Taoism, but the Taoism that this intervention centers on it's sort of the philosophical branch of Taoism. And it's not, I mean, there's other parts of it, but I would say that like the central premise is really about naturalism, right? So it's really about trying to align with kind of the natural order of the universe, right? That there's this like these sort of larger forces that govern the universe, and as human beings to kind of return in a way to kind of this like state of innocence or state of connectedness to that larger order, right? And that's in contrast with Confucianism, where it's much more focused on human relations, and trying to sort of structure society in a way that promotes harmony and order at sort of the human relationship realm. Yeah, do you want to add anything to that, Peter?
Well,
There's so much.
well, it's funny that that was actually, I think one time America may hear about Taoism is actually from Bruce Lee, because Bruce Lee was known to combine Taoist philosophy with martial art. So he created a branch of martial art that actually have the Taoist principle involved. So that's why one of the famous quote from Bruce Lee is "Be water," because water is sort of a symbol of go with the natural flow of nature, and water can be soft yet very powerful. And it's a nice metaphor, I guess, not just for physical training, but also for our mental capacity or mental ability to deal with difficulties in life. I mean, you're the expert in this, so that I try my best.
No, I love the idea of water. I mean, water is the central metaphor in Taoism, and I think it's such a powerful metaphor because it does embody I think what is what it means to kind of live your life in accordance with the Tao. So in addition to the flowing flexible nature of water, it is life-giving, right? So all life originates from water. Like you cannot be alive without without water. So there's this sort of, you can feel that sort of life energy that's part of that. Water is also really humble, right? So in the Tao Te Ching, they talk about how water flows to its lowest point. Like if you have a vessel, it's always going to find that hole, that gap. It's going to flow downward, right? And so there's a valuing of humility, right? That we're never too important to kind of be down there, with everyone else, kind of, right? So there's like a humility to it, there's a strength to it, and obviously it can be soft and it can be hard, right? So the most destructive force in the universe is water, right? Like you can think about hurricanes, you can think about flooding, you can think about tsunamis and all of these things. And also it is very, very, it can be really soft as well, right? And and yet even just one drop over generations can wear away the heart of stone, right? So it's all of these things, all of these contradictions, and yet it's like at the seed of life.
Yeah, those are a great example of Taoist philosophy, and I think Buddhism, especially Chinese Buddhism, have some relationship with Taoism because when Buddhism passed from India to China, Buddhism was somewhat integrated with the Taoist philosophy in China. So that is where Zen Buddhism actually came from, which has the Taoist flavor to it. So I think like Zen Buddhists do have some basic understanding of some Taoist philosophy in some way. When we talk about things like non-attachment or wu wei, non-reaction, there is some relationship related to these two philosophical approaches. And
Yeah.
so how do you integrate this Taoist philosophy, which I guess it's like virtues, right? They are like important virtues with cognitive therapy. That's a very Western approach.
That's a really good question because it's not so obvious, right? So for those of you who are students of psychology, you know that, in traditional cognitive therapy, you're really kind of working with clients, belief systems, their interpretations of the world, beliefs that they have, and you're kind of picking them apart a little bit. You're trying to challenge them in terms of logic and sort of reason-based analyses. And Taoist cognitive therapy is similar in some ways, but what's different is that the developers of the original intervention came in with a very strong value position. And they said essentially suffering comes from a failure to live your life in a way that's aligned with the Tao. So suffering comes from resisting the reality of your situation, the reality of the world, and being in conflict with it. And so the analysis within this type of therapy is really around where are you resisting and where can you be more aligned versus is this logical, is this reasonable, right? So it's a really different way of proceeding with treatment. And so the goal from the provider's perspective is to socialize the client into a Taoist worldview. And the assumption is that the more that our clients can live with alignment according to these principles, the less they will suffer. Right. So I can show you what these principles are
Oh,
if
great.
now's a good time.
Great. That's good.
Okay.
So there are several principles that Dr. Chan would integrate it with the Western cognitive therapy. And here are the 8 principles. 8 principles.
Yeah, so these are the 8 principles, and these were again developed by Dr. Zhang and Dr. Yang, and they've published one article an English language journal, and then the rest are available in Chinese journals. So this is like my translation and then kind of interpretation of the principles. But you can see here what the core values are. And so what you would do in the therapy is you would sort of take a situation like, and you maybe each of you sitting there might be thinking about a challenging situation that you are currently dealing with. Maybe it's causing you a lot of worry, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety or fear. Maybe you're feeling really stuck about how to proceed. You can kind of play with, how it is that you're coping with that scenario in relation to these different values, right? So the first one is about collective benefit. And so I might ask my client, like, this thing that you're doing right now, to what degree is it causing you harm or causing others harm? And to what degree is this beneficial to you, right? And so they might think, well, this thing that I'm doing it out of fear, out of worry, or whatever, but I can see how that is harming me, or I can see how that is having ripple effects and it's harming others, right? And so we kind of play with this idea of like, well, what kind of action might you take that can actually maximize benefit to self and others, right? Second one is that it is about non-competition. And I think this is actually a really important one for those of us who are constantly feeling like we're in this rat race, we're competing with others, there's not enough to go around, and we might find ourselves comparing, where we're at in our lives to someone else. And often we're like feeling like we're falling short in some way. Someone else is more successful, more attractive, whatever, than we are. And so this second principle is really around thinking about the importance of acknowledging your unique positions, strengths, and seeing ourselves clearly and understanding that we are in our own life journey, and others are on their own life journeys, and we each have a very unique role to play in this larger universe, right? And so the goal is to like lean into your uniqueness and don't compare yourself to others.
Easier said than done. Yeah.
Easier said than done, right? But like how powerful, right? And so from a Taoist perspective, we tell stories about how you can kind of see this playing out in nature. And one of the classic stories is really around like, the mouse does not compete with a lion, right? A mouse isn't like looking at that lion like, oh my God, he's so much more powerful than I am, right? The mouse is just doing their mousy things, Um, and so to really own where you're sitting in the world and what you uniquely have to offer, and acting within those constraints, and also those strengths, and acknowledging that we do have limits. Okay. So there's something also kind of liberating about accepting that, about ourselves. So I won't go through all of them, but you can see how the values are around, moderation, accepting that, we can change some things we can't, to align ourselves with the values of harmony and modesty, humility, trying to be flexible as a way of responding to adversity versus like, a rigid kind of confrontational stance. And then the last are really the core of a Taoist worldview, which is about Wu Wei, or actionless non-action, which is really trying to have our actions be somewhat effortless. And the idea is that if we are seeing things clearly, and if we are acknowledging the reality of there being constraints, and we are looking for opportunity to achieve our goals, then we can be like water. We can flow around those obstacles, and it doesn't have to be so hard. And the last one obviously is about acknowledging that things are going to unfold around us, and to just kind of allow and accept that things are going to unfold naturally, um, on its own accord. So these are the 8 values.
And I think these 8 values are sort of like a quick summary of the Taoist wisdom that could be useful for not just clients, but for all of us sitting here right now, because any of these principles, moderations, acceptance, flexibility, are very useful wisdom that can be applied
Yeah.
in daily life. And I think this is also in the trend. I mean, this is similar to the positive psychology, where we sort of study the virtues of different culture and how we can sort of figure out our character strength, our personal strength that go along with the virtues of that culture. So I found this work quite interesting.
And I mean, I think you can see how very different it is from a Western mindset in some ways, where it's all about competition. It's all about pushing to achieve whatever your dreams are. It's like, think about how we say, like, anybody can be anything as long as they work hard enough, right? This is actually saying the opposite, which is no, not everybody can be everything. Like, we all have limits and constraints,
Right.
some of which we impose on others, and some of which others impose on us.
Mm-hmm.
But the sort of the best way to approach living is to acknowledge those constraints and act within them. So I have a story that might actually be helpful in illuminating these things. And this is
Great.
like, the more that I've learned about this, the more I think that my mother has been the role model for me in terms of what it looks like to live a life that is aligned, with the Tao, even though I don't know that she herself would label it that way. So my mom was an immigrant, like so many of us, and she talks about coming to the U.S., with my dad, not speaking English very well, having graduated, from college in Taiwan with like a business degree, and feeling like just so competent. It's like in her own native language and country, she felt like such a badass. She's like, oh, I was like popular and I had these great jobs and everybody thought I was so smart and all this. So she comes to the US, and of course, she can't be that person here because nobody recognizes the degree. They can't understand her language, you know. So she talks about those early years being really, really challenging because she had to take jobs that, weren't similar at all to how she was trained. She was just trying to find anything that she could get to earn enough income to support us, because by then I had been born. And so, she talks about doing that for many years, taking odd jobs, but her background was in business, and so she talks about going around and going to like yard sales, like stoop sales here that we have, and coming upon this box, and she finds this book, and the book was $1, and the book was a book on real estate. So she's like, oh, I'm a business minded person. You know, I like the idea of working towards owning something, right? Everybody wants to own property. And so she's like, okay, it's $1. So she buys the book for $1. And then essentially over the course of the next, I don't know, 40 years, 30 years, she has she has built like this whole real estate business of buying and selling properties, of becoming the owner of like many, many, residential properties, helping others in her community learn how to get a mortgage, how to, all of that stuff. And she talks about the reason she did it is because she could take her time in translating the book. She, in some ways, would go into the bank and ask to meet with the banker, and she knew that her English was bad, and she knew that they were assuming that she didn't know what she was doing. And she would, over time, she was like, they never expected me to know what I was talking about because of her English and her accent. And so she was in some way able to kind of, develop over time relationships with bankers, people started to realize like, wow, she kind of knows what she's doing. She's paying these properties off really fast. And she really credits, well, to me, I sort of observed this as like, wow, she didn't have traditional access to social capital. She had to kind of seize opportunity that was presented to her. And this was a path that she saw that would allow her to be aligned with her true nature, which is a businesswoman, within the realities of trying to develop a life as an immigrant in a very white dominated environment. And just seeing this as something that could unfold over a lifetime. So I love that story because I do think it like acknowledges, okay, I'm never going to have this, but I can do this instead. And ooh, maybe I should be open to the possibility of what I might learn from this $1 book, you know? So I think that that's a really good illustration of what it can look like to embody these values and principles in your own life.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story because that's the typical story of a lot of immigrants where they have to face the status change where they were doing very well. They come to a new country where they have to really adjust to the reality here with things or challenges they never had. But it sounds like your mom is a wonderful, successful story of how she's knowing her strength and limitations and able to transform that into a very wonderful lifestyle. So it's great that you shared this story with all of us. Yeah. I wonder, I think this is a good time. I wonder our audience have any question for Dr. Chen regarding cultural competencies or Taoist philosophies. This is the typical reaction I get when I'm teaching, by the way. I don't know if you get the same, but we have one down, all the way down there. Okay.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for setting this up, by the way. This is really cool. So out of the 8 principles, which one have you seen that is the most challenging for folks?
The Wu Wei principle is the hardest. It's the hardest for folks. It is legitimately a very abstract concept. The idea of actionless non-action. People are like, what? What is that? In our research, we found that even Chinese folks regularly misunderstood the idea of Wu Wei. And there were some people interpreted it as, well, what can you do? You know, this kind of like this passive acceptance that, oh, well, this is just how it is, you know, and you can imagine how problematic that could be for like someone with depression, right? Like that's the core, what am I with it's
the
like
pathology, core
right.
belief. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a core belief. Like the future is terrible, the present is terrible, the past is right, and so there's nothing we can do to change things. And I think that is a common misunderstanding. That's like this real fatalistic view of things. And I really want to challenge that. That is not what Wu Wei means. I think Wu Wei is essentially saying that yes, there are constraints, right? There are things that we cannot control, but if we know what they are, we can maneuver around them. Okay? It is not that different from the idea of water meeting stone, right? It's like, well, there's the stone. Can't do much about the stone, but oh, look, here's a tiny little crack in the stone. Okay, maybe I'll just keep pushing against that crack, and over time, that crack is going to get bigger. Or maybe there's like a tiny little, you know, a little way that I can like kind of sneak around that stone, right? So we're looking for opportunities to maneuver, right? We're not just kind of throwing up our hands like, oh, there's a stone, you know. And I think that capacity to think creatively, to think flexibly, to take advantage of opportunities when they arise, that real action part of it allows things to be more effortless, you know, because we're not trying to push away the stone. We're just trying to find ways to work around it. So that's the thing that I really want people to understand about like how transformative this idea of Wu Wei can be.
Yeah, Wu Wei is actually one of the most important principle in Taoist philosophy, if I remember correctly. It also has this like a effortless effort kind of connotation to it, right?
Right. Some of you might be more familiar with the idea of flow, like being in a flow state, right? And so there, right, some similarity in some ways of that feeling of ease, that it shouldn't feel that hard. that there should be this kind of naturalness to our actions and the choices that we make, right? So opening to seeing the world in all of its possibility.
Great. Excellent question. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Any other?
How do you, in your everyday life, manage to, I guess, keep your peace with the actual responsibilities of everyday life, like bills, a strict schedule? How do you suggest an everyday person start?
And she's 10 times busier than what most of us.
Yeah, so what do you do?
Yeah. I mean, I think that this is actually where self-compassion is really important. So I have a clinical practice. I see patients 1 day a week. And I will say that self-compassion is really hard for most of us. You know, this ability to not be so hard on ourselves, but also have some hope and optimism, right? That we can pursue the things that matter to us, right? And so it's a both and that we're striving to live a life that is aligned with our values. And at the same time, knowing that we're not perfect beings, that we're going to have days where we don't feel like doing anything, or we're going to have days where we feel overwhelmed. And to accept that that's part of the human condition, that we can be both striving and productive and also feeling overwhelmed and stuck sometimes, so that we're giving space for the fullness of that experience. I do think that like having a regular mindfulness or contemplative practice of some kind is really important for wellness and for coping with stress. And I'm not perfect at it by any means. Like right now, I think it's been like 2 weeks since I've meditated, but I had been pretty consistent for a while. But then, the semester gets busy and it's like, oh, I feel the difference when I'm not waking up in the morning and doing like 15 minutes of meditation.
What
It's
could be
important
one way
because
about it?
right, I'm just like, oh, right now I'm not doing it. Okay, I'm gonna look for an opportunity to like get that started again, right? And not beat myself up over it. Just kind of acknowledge like I'm not a robot, right? Like we're not perfect. So I think having a regular contemplative practice where you're reflecting on where you're at, I think trying to live your life in a way that is aligned with what's important to you, and then giving yourself grace and self-compassion when you feel like you're not able to live up to those ideals. And it's a sort of evolving process, and there's always an opportunity, as Sharon Salzberg says, to begin again, right? Just start over. Just pick yourself up, try again.
Great. Be mindful, have self-compassion is something that's very useful. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Great
Another
answer.
question? Great.
What's your most effective method of helping people overcome internal biases?
Good question.
That's such a good question. So let me think about that for a minute. Well, I mean, we've talked about there. So I can tell you a little bit about what the research suggests about this. That biases actually arise automatically, right? So just the way that we can't control our thoughts, we cannot control the biases that get elicited in our minds, in our consciousness. What we can control is how we respond to those internal automatic thoughts, right? So that's the space where we can maneuver. And so what seems to be helpful, there's a number of things, but I think one thing that seems to be helpful is one, like getting really familiar about what those biases are that get elicited in us. Learning how to tolerate the discomfort of knowing like, oh, it's in there. Like, oh, I can't believe that thought keeps cropping up, and like learning how to separate out your beliefs and values from those thoughts. Again, not judging that they're present. How could they not be present? But just then getting some control over your behaviors. So there's some research that suggests that you can kind of learn to overcome behaviors that can be problematic. Like maybe some of those behaviors are like you avoid people from that group because you're so worried you're going to say something wrong, or you're so worried you're going to commit a microaggression, and so you just kind of avoid them. And that just perpetuates the bias, right? Because you're not encountering experiences that are going to change the way you think about that group. You have to like go out in the world, have different experiences, and then your ideas start to change, right? So there's some work around like how can you begin to change your behavioral responses to those biases, using contemplative practices to help you regulate your emotions. Maybe you feel anxious when you're encountering people from that group. How can you monitor your breath? How can you develop other ways of connecting with folks from other groups, and just actually starting to put into practice behaviors that are more reflective with how you really want to show up in the world, right? So doing it anyway, even if you feel awkward, even if you feel anxious, and it's really taking those actions that will begin to expand those ideas you have, and then you just get this feedback loop, of like, oh, okay, it's not so bad. Look at me, I'm like able to have a conversation and not feel so self-conscious. And it starts to then, I think, shift your natural response in the world. So, and as part of that, I think, some of the work I've done around mindfulness shows that cultivating mindfulness can decrease expressions of bias in interpersonal contexts. Whoever asked that question, what do you think about that? Does that seem doable?
Yeah.
I think that's definitely possible. It'll definitely take like maybe like months or even like years of accomplishing that and getting a lot better at it. But it's a process, and it's something that I could start like even implementing right now. So thank you for your response.
Yeah, I mean, you can even practice this on the subway. It's like when you're sitting on the subway and you're looking around the train car, you probably can just do a scan of like, what are the thoughts that are popping up, right? And we have labels that pop into our heads. You're like, this person, this person, this person. And if you just allow that to happen, you can notice, wow, there's a lot of assumptions and judgments I'm making about every single person on this train, right? And you can kind of, instead of trying to just ignore them, you can instead try to replace them with a more compassionate, um, a compassionate response in which you're recognizing your shared humanity, right? And there's some really beautiful contemplative practices like loving kindness practices or compassion practices that try to help you see that person as similar to you in the most fundamental ways of human existence. You know, they are also trying to reduce their own suffering. They're trying to be happy. They're trying to be comfortable, you know? And so you can try but to cultivate the sense of expansiveness, even in your own mind as you're just encountering people on the train. And that's some mental training that can, have really powerful impacts on, in terms of disrupting those automatic thoughts and automatic biases.
I think that's a wonderful practice, right? We all could do it when we go home later. We're sitting in the subway. We're going to be sitting there watching people walking by, and we're going to see how many labels we have for every single person that passed by, right? It's like, yeah, that person, that person, that person. I mean, I have students before say she hates people. She hates every single person that she see on the subway. I mean, we all have so many labels, but I think this we can all practice just to become aware of the labels that we have. Not just towards others, but also towards ourselves too, I think, because we all have labels for so many different things. And because if we are not aware of it, we're more likely to create a world that's even more unfair and discriminating towards each other. Right. Any other question? Final question?
My grandson is going to medical college. So how old I am. But anyway, Because I saw only one hand, I thought I'm too old to raise hand for when you ask about how many people know about Taoism. The first book I encountered in English is by Benjamin Hoff. It's called The Tao of the Pooh and the De of the Piglet. So it's a good book to, I learned Winnie the Pooh from this book because
The Tao of the Pool, yeah, that's
the Tao
a
of the
famous
Pooh and
book.
the Tao
Yeah,
of the
a
Piglet.
famous book.
Another book is by Alan Cohen. It's called The Tao Made It Easy. The Tao Made It Easy.
The Tao Made It Easy. Okay,
Yeah. It's a good book too. I start from the I think St. John's professor, one writing English, Wu Jinxiong and Xue Guangqian. That's how I started with Taoism.
Yeah.
Another book, a kind of question for
Our,
for
our speaker, yeah.
yeah, is are you aware of Dr. Daniel Siegel?
Daniel Siegel, yes.
Daniel Siegel, it's called Aware, the book. It's a bestseller, a New York Times bestseller, Aware. And he also had a book, 21 lessons. I can remember the subtitle. 21 lessons to learn, become aware.
Become aware.
Yeah.
Great,
so
great.
because he, I don't know how I call that word. He initiate the idea of wheel of awareness in his book, My Sight. My Sight. And he said, all our experiences, internal, external, will affect our neurons. He's starting to explain all the awareness, how that can help us to transform everything, including the relationship. In that book, it's called My Sight. It's a more difficult book. Yeah, so I don't know whether doctor has, know about Daniel Siegel. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
Great.
thank you.
I haven't read those books. I'm aware of his work. I've met him a few times. Very important. I don't know, Peter, if he's even been part of this cafe, because it seems like somebody you would have invited, right?
I haven't yet, but he would definitely be one I want to invite. And by the way, Dr. Chen is one of the important researcher in the mindfulness contemplative science field right now. And I mean, you're part of the ISCR, right? International Society of Contemplative Research. So for students who are interested in mindfulness research, contemplative science, Dr. Chen is sort of one of the key researchers right now, which you should all pay attention to her books. And I think you actually have one new book that could be useful for our students because it's for the BIPOC students.
Yeah, I have a new edited volume that's coming out on transformative careers in mental health for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And it is about it's strategies for promoting healing and social change. And it really is about folks like me, maybe folks like you who are entering the mental health care professions like psychology, social work, psychiatry. And we're discovering that we're encountering a lot of ethnocentrism, a lot of racism, a lot of structural barriers that are affecting our ability to deliver services in ways that are culturally affirming and equitable to minoritized communities like ours. And it's their personal essays from 27 leaders in the field, different BIPOC leaders, kind of really giving advice on how can you develop a career that is transformative in ways that don't destroy your soul. Like back to one of the questions around how do you juggle these things? How do you just manage your life? And they give some really fantastic pieces of advice and guidance about really not taking in messages that say you don't belong here, that you have to do it just the way we do it, and to really honor the cultural wisdom that we each have.
Yeah, it sounds like a wonderful book. And for some of our, I guess some of my students who want to be in the mental health field, that should be something you should check it up for sure. Any take-home message for our audience?
I would just invite you to try on the idea of being like water. That has really helped me in my own life. It's helped me feel like I have more agency and power than I may think I have at any given moment. And to sort of look for the openings, look for the opportunities. So thank you for being here and for your great questions. And I really wish I could be there in person with you all.
And I love your conclusion. That was be water is sort of my favorite quote from Bruce Lee, and I think that applied to all of us as well. Be water, my friend. That's what Bruce Lee said. And thank you for attending our wonderful conversation with Dr. Chen. And it's great that we're all here together to talk about these wonderful issues together. So thank you. Thank you for being here. And thank you, Dr. Chen.
Thank you. Appreciate it. This is really fun.